So, as everyone maybe read already, the title of our online meeting is if we have to look at the act of the 7th of October as an isolated act, or can we put it in a broader context? And there are many aspects that can be considered. So I would like to give over to maybe Sladjana first. Like, what would be your short answer to this question if we have to put it in a broader context? I see you already smiling, probably because of short, but let's hear what you have to say.
Hi, good afternoon. I almost said good morning, but I guess it's almost good morning on Anna's side. Hello to everyone, and hi Anna, nice to see you again. Yeah, I was kind of smiling because of the short answer, because the short answer will open the door for a very long answer. So I don't think that we can start the timeline or the temporality when we talk about Palestine on the 7th of October, and the reason why there is an insistence or starting there is part of the larger question, and the larger context, because when we talk about the context of the Palestine, we talk about the settler colonial context, and the settler colonialism as a system of power is an ongoing process, is an ongoing system of power that normalizes continuous occupation, dispossession, annexion, displacement, exploitation of lands, of resources, exploitation of peoples, of their labor, of their relations, of their emotions, and their knowledges. And I want to particularly underline here the ongoing system and the normalization of violence, because I'm sure that we will get back to that later, because I think those are also the crucial points when we talk about the imposition or kind of the attempt to impose this temporality of starting the clock on the 7th of October, because as a general principle, the settler colonies or settler colonialism aims to remove the indigenous inhabitants, right, and to bring the settlers from elsewhere. And this includes drawing on the interlocking systems of oppression and oppressive and kind of combining different regimes of power, including the kind of control of the narratives and an attempt to impose the temporality. And I think I can go further, but I would rather stop here and give Anna's words and then kind of have a conversation than just to have a monologue.
Yeah, thank you, Sladjana. I think you already nailed it with the most important pillars of what settler colonialism is. Maybe a bit of a historical context to it as well. Settler colonialism, or as what we kind of consider settler colonialism to be, started in the 15th/16th century with the conquest of the Americas, where the first large-scale population transfer and import took place. And by that, I mean the genocidal killing and enslavement of the indigenous population of the Americas. They're shipping to Europe as slaves, or Madagascar or the Antilles, or other parts of North America, for instance. And vice versa, in fact. So Native Americans have been shipped all across and throughout the Americas, as well as to Europe, as well as to other parts of the four continents. And then obviously replacing this genocidally killed and shipped off population with enslaved Africans. Hence, we see the emergence of the plantation economy, and everything else that colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, or settler colonial studies are usually engaged with through one lens or another. In terms of settler colonialism, I think what is also important to say is that there's no colonial conquest in the world, really, where there is not also, at least for a certain amount and for some time, a settler colonial approach to the country, even if only by a small elite or businesses. So that should be said as well. One of the most pronounced and most well-known settler colonial studies researchers kind of coined this term, settler colonialism, as a structure and not an event, which is what indigenous people usually often rephrase in a regular manner. So from, Turtle Island to Palestine to Australia, what those who consider and name themselves as natives or indigenous or the people who inherited the land would say is that whether we call it Nakba or genocide, it is still ongoing, right? It hasn't stopped even after 300 or 400 years or 500 years in the Americas, for instance. So if genocide is a structure, massacre are its events, I once wrote in a paper. So it's more a question of what is the extent of massacre and genocide really, and when it kind of pivots itself up to a larger scale mass killing than a low scale mass killing, for instance. We should also kind of remember that Israel is still in its frontier war, settler colonial expansion moment. 75 or 80 years is really nothing for a settler colonial country to exist. If we speak of the 500-year-long durée of settler colonial or colonial engagements of Europe and the rest of the world. So by frontier wars, I mean the actual still elimination of the native, right? So today, for instance, the United States of America, which you probably know better, is a kind of slow motion killing, very slow paced, often sanitized through securitization, policing, or capitalism, the replacement of populations because they can't afford to live there anymore, because they're seen as a threat. Usually this is Black buddies or people of color or indigenous buddies as well. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna stop it at that. And the larger context again of this, not only have Palestinians since the 70s, Fayez Sayeh, for instance, is the most pronounced scholar, Palestinian scholar, who wrote on Zionism as settler colonialism, and yet he's very seldomly quoted. Interestingly enough, I think there's also obviously, as usual, an erasure and genocide of the scholarship that those who are considered natives bring to the table. And in 1982, the events in Lebanon, concretely Sabra and Shatila, where Israel has armed, trained, and funded a Christian fascist militia to go into Palestinian camps and literally erase and eradicate everyone, including donkeys, horses, children, has been deemed a genocidal act in 1982, or afterwards actually, by the UN. So even that has a precedent, and we're here speaking about legal terminologies and UN bodies. And it's very difficult to get the worst of the worst atrocities recognized as such in international law or in front of the UN even, because usually there are political impetuses that stop that from happening, right? So if it actually is declared a genocidal act, or if it is declared a genocide, then usually it was, because a lot of genocides have not been declared that. And maybe Sladjana wants to talk about that actually. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's. I really liked how you fleshed out that the structure and event, because I think that also speaks to the temporality and this imposition of temporality, right? Because as I said, and you as well, it is an ongoing process, right? And it's includes on these interlocking systems of oppression on as you pointed out, both like the racism, the like white supremacy, hetero-cis patriarchy, capitalism, or in our time, the global racial neoliberal capitalism, right? And it also kind of how shall I put it, draws on these oppressive regimes of power that are supporting the system and its everyday violence. And I also want to talk about the everyday violence, because I think instead of just talking about the so-called spectacular violence in these events, when we recognize that there is a violence, there is an everyday violence that is tied to the settler colonialism. Because settler colonialism, as I said, it's an overarching framework, right? And in the case of Palestine, we have within that framework, we also have the regimes of apartheid. We have the military occupation of what is now known as Gaza Strip, which is also a colonial imposition, right? As a name. And I would perhaps like us to tonight also talk about this imposition of the vocabulary that is also part of the project. And Anna also pointed it out when she said, are we talking about Nakba, or are we talking about genocide, right? But also in the sense that another kind of regime, or the oppressive regime of power that is in place, is an ethno-nationalist imperialist project that is there. So we can talk about every modern nation state as an apparatus of violence, and as a state that kind of as an enterprise that kind of thrives and comes into existence by annexing certain lands. But the one particular characteristic of the settler colonialism is that it cannot claim the sovereignty over a land unless it erases the indigenous people and their knowledges. So the struggle against the settler colonialism is a liberational struggle, but it's also a struggle against erasure, against elimination, right? So that brings additional, I would say, kind of a layered into the conversation. But when it comes to the violence of the settler colonialism, it is an ongoing violence, because as I said, I want to go back to the moment of the how did I put it in the beginning? The normalization of violence, right? Because I would argue that that normalization of violence within the settler colonialism is important for understanding this temporality, why we cannot agree to kind of start the clock on the 7th of October, because the insistence on the 7th of October, I would say, is a part of the erasure, is a part of the violence, right? And I would invite here, perhaps quote Sarah Schroff, whom I'm sure that Anna already knows about, a queer feminist of color, peace scholar, who spoke of peace as a standard for violence, right? It is which means that peace, when we talk like in mainstream discussion, when we talk about peace, especially in international relations, even the peace studies, we talk about peace as a standard for violence, as the violence towards certain forms, intensity of violence, and violence towards certain bodies, towards lands, certain lands or landscapes or geographies that we deem acceptable, right? So that's the everyday violence of the settler colonialism. And then we have these exceptional violence that Anna also called as an event within the structure, right? The massacres that get kind of that's allowed the regime to kind of become unhinged, right? And usually those moments we have when there is a certain how shall I put it, when the regime, the system of oppression, feels as if there is a certain unsafety or insecurity for the system, right? So when the system and certain bodies who are not marked by the colonial difference, when they feel as they are endangered, so that is used as an excuse to kind of unleash this unhinged exceptional violence, and then we start seeing that. But the fact is that if we only focus on those events of violence, then we erase the everyday violence and the whole structure, and that then we become also kind of part of perpetuating a violence of silencing, of erasure. I don't know if I have been how should I put it, clear enough, but I think I would stop here. But yeah.
And maybe one last thing to kind of finish what Sladjana already so wonderfully summarized right now. I want to speak a little bit about native resistance as well, because that's not just the problem for settler colonialism. I think that's a problem generally within a colonial framework, where I include racism as a part of it, right? So Fanon teaches us that any kind of speaking back, any kind of resistance, even if it is, and I want to stress that again, the majority of Palestinian resistance is until today nonviolent, which is obviously completely erased, not seen, or not taken seriously. And the minute there is actual physical resistance, it is often, framed as this exceptional attack on Western values. So now, what I find interesting is that whether that is from critical racism studies or from colonial studies, we know that any kind of speaking back is seen by those in power, by the sovereign, by white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, as violence. So even if you just write a pamphlet or you come together and you write, newspapers, right? That was seen throughout history by colonizers, settler colonial regimes, as well as racist regimes within Europe, as a form of violence and countered with even more violence. And usually those that then were targeted with that, punishment for resisting this imposition have been framed within the worst terminologies ever, right? So from beasts to devils, and a force that is not of this place and not of this world, but also not divine, right? It's not a divine intervention; it's the intervention of evil usually. And I think once you mystify and abstract it to such an extent, as though Palestinians wake up in the morning and are born as evil suicide bombers or something like that, kind of serves the purpose, whether that is the capitalist or the settler colonial purpose, to misrepresent and misinform a public, misrepresent those who resist, and misinform the wider public to whom the sovereign is speaking about what the actual roots for social conflict are. So speaking about violence in Palestine for Palestinians means to basically speak about violence every single day. There is not one instance in Palestinian life, in history, at least since the establishment of Zionism or Zionist forces on historical Palestine, as well as during British occupation, obviously, or colonialism, that hasn't been violent. From public speaking to extrajudicial killings to children being kidnapped on a regular basis, coming back in body bags and realizing they've been zipped up whilst they were still alive. Just today I learned it was really difficult that the latest onslaught on Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, that people now know that amongst the dead, more than 200 people dead, where they were tortured, amongst them children, and then buried alive. I mean, we've seen pictures by now of people and heard images of people being overrun by bulldozers, right? So this mystification as pure devil and evil has direct implications on how people are being killed. There's no, somebody brings up Dirk Moses, that the transgression becomes the new normal and is actually condoned as something necessary in order to root out, the cockroaches, the, whatever, the vermin, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always been slow killing and erasure in Palestine, and it is only being visible if a certain group of people are attacked and not of others. I think that's the summary of a general colonial problem.
Thank you. So you've put let's say the in the context of settler colonialism, and you I think explained very well this dehumanization part, where Palestinians are being showed as evil, or as maybe one of the latest expressions as human animals. So maybe to motivate or to enable their soldiers to do what they're doing, right? To enable this evil act with killing with bulldozers and everything. But do you feel like did this dehumanization like cross the borders of Israel? Like if we look, like we as an initiative, we experience how much ignorant people are here, let's say in Austria, with regards to the Palestinian cause. So would you also say that this dehumanization also reached us here in Austria, in the West, so that we actually don't really care what is happening down there? Maybe.
I mean, I'm sorry, but this is the first time people actually care. So maybe it comes from, the question already comes from a very particular perspective, namely those that are now waking up to the realities on the ground in a particular part of the world, right? So what is going on, I also want to say that, is not specific and unique to Palestine. Again, there's a historical continuity of what is happening in Palestine today, which is why people have been so desensitized to look before, to engage before, to care before. And obviously, as Aimé Césaire said, we let this, this heart rot to such an extent that people they don't see it anymore as something inhumane. And, people or Europe want to talk about, its own history on a regular basis, in particular to, with reference to the Nazi past. And at the same time, completely leave out the colonial violence that has been going on for 400 to 500 years, where they have also been kind of blind to when it actually happened. So I think the question, to answer it very shortly, other than me writing about it, of course, this is a transnational phenomena. This is not just Israel killing Palestinians. It was never just Israel killing Palestinians. Israel would have not come into existence had it not had quite powerful European allies to fund it, to arm it, to even give it the right to the land. So yeah, that's I think what is way more interesting is how Palestinians today have come to symbolize this very transnational, universally operating figure that was once, supposedly the Jew, and it still is, but in a different manner. I think we see a shift and, a change in racialization when it comes to Judaism, or Jews in particular, and Ashkenazi Jews in particular. But today, the Palestinian comes to kind of fill in this void that once Jews have served for white Western civilization to a large extent as this, figure that is everywhere, that is threatening national cohesion, that is bringing insecurity and terror today, right? That wants to undermine research institutions and politics, right? All of these conspiracy theories that were once said about supposed Jewish influence on European politics. And I might say this was not just a German invention. The Germans executed it and framed their entire nationalism around it. But it was not just the Germans who were anti-Semites. So yeah, I think today we see a very interesting convergence of new racialization processes where the figure of the Palestinian becomes this transnationally operating figure that needs to be eradicated in order to supposedly save another transnationally operating figure, namely the Jew on the brink of extinction, which is a white fantasy to my mind, because as we learned from genocide studies as well as from settler colonial studies, what the settler believes, even if only in fantasy, is that we want to eliminate everyone. So we don't even see them. So indigenous studies has always said, look, guys, we're still here. You think you killed all of us, but you didn't, right? And so a similar fate is happening, for instance, in Europe or in Germany, where everybody assumes that, like all Jews are gone. That's not true, Yeah, so basically, to make it short, this kind of fantasy, race and fantasy are very deeply and intimately interwoven. You cannot have racialization without phantasmatic investments into it. So yeah, I think that would be my short/longer answer right now. I don't know if it made sense, so ask questions if I didn't make any sense right now. I'm usually better in writing, but yeah.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. It also speaks to many of the things that we have already pointed out with the colonial difference and how the colonial difference makes people and their knowledge and like their labor, even their relations, right, disposable. And I think what you brought another point that is very interesting and that I think we should stress more, and that is that despite this historical continuity of violence that is undisputable, there is also historical continuity of transnational solidarities, which the Palestinians have been an important part of, and which has been also built around Palestine, right? But if we look from the Standing Rock to South Africa, we have the history of transnational solidarity, of people who understand intuitively with their bodies, not only with their intellect and with their histories, what a settler colonialism is, and what genocidal, actually omnicidal violence, if I may say, means, and what kind of consequences of that are. Yes, the fact that you pointed out that Palestinians have become this global figure, and that kind of has this unfortunately capacity that comes with a huge price to mobilize people transnationally. And I think if we just look now at the student movements and what is happening across the countries, from US, France to Italy, we can see how that operates, but also how there is at times kind of perhaps that awareness disappears or gets a bit silenced, but there is this, I think, also awareness among the people that the apparatus of violence can turn to anyone at any point, because anyone can. It's not only about the Palestinians. It's not, even though now we should speak especially about the Palestinians, but the reaction against those who express solidarity towards Palestinians in Germany, in the US, and also how this how the states react towards the student protest. They're showing how this violence can be what's the word I'm looking for? It can be mobilized in a blink of an eye in order to protect this kind of the system as it is, to prevent the solidarities working. So I think also when we shift the focus and talk about the solidarities and the mobilization of people, we also kind of break this narrative of that is constantly reproduced from the system, how we should think about this violence, and how we should, what kind of vocabulary we should use, and what we should explain in order to kind of use that the shifting of the narrative as a kind of a smoke screen to shield itself from actually a discussion that would shake the system or show how violent and disruptive the system is.
Regarding repression, like you said, like the system, if I may just transit to another topical point with a story, like we were once organizing an info table here in Innsbruck at the center, and with info material about Palestine and everything. And once a huge man arrived to us, like he was quite tall, and he introduced himself. He said he really likes what we are doing and everything. And then he said, and this is a true story, death to the Jews. Like he openly said he wishes death to the Jews. And we like shamelessly asked him if he's a Nazi or something. And he said, no, he identifies as a poisoner or something like that. But what I'm reflecting on, when I went home and reflected on this moment, I was like, there are really people who wish death to the Jews openly here in our rows, like in our society. But the same term, anti-Semitism, is also used against me or against our initiative when we wish freedom to Palestinian people. And when I compare, like there's one person who wishes death to us, to the Jews, and we who wish freedom to the Palestinian people, then I kind of have a problem that someone calls me the same as this guy, right? So is this system like also using the term anti-Semitism to repress us, or is the term misused maybe? Or like how did the term anti-Semitism evolve to such a state, if I may ask?
Anna, do you want to take this first, because this is your strong suit?
I really don't want to circle back to talk about anti-Semitism at a moment of genocide against Palestinians. That's number one, right? And I also wanted to ask you, I feel like there were 3 questions at least in what you said right now. So the first, I didn't really understand what this man responded. Maybe you can write it in the chat again, because maybe it's like some Austrian terminology, or I just didn't catch it immediately. But I always wonder, what is the political goal of asking Palestinians this question? Because I am not, a white man, tall and strong from Austria. I cannot speak for him. I don't know what went wrong in his mind. He apparently has a very low racial literacy. And by that, I mean knowledge of race and racism and its history. Clearly, he's using whatever he thinks is useful for his narrative. But why do I have to respond to this person's, excuse my French, but very racist and fucked up ideology? Why am I and Palestinians becoming the ones that have to answer for this? Why does the general white population of Austria and Germany and Europe does not have to answer this? I don't see this question being asked to a white person on a panel, okay, that might be even half the opposite of my opinion. They forget these questions, get the questions, answer it. Okay, so what is the political goal of asking me or any other Palestinian or even Jew that question? So I say, I want you guys, when you ask us these, to think about this, or even the audience, because I get this all the time when I sit in front of public audiences with predominantly white people. That is the question that I get. And usually the question that comes after that, how can I then join a pro-Palestine demo if there might be a crazy nutcase like this guy? I'm like, have you ever been to any demonstration in the world, honestly, where you agreed with everyone generally? There are even laws in Germany that even if there's one Nazi amongst them, that you're not legally, allowed to label everyone a Nazi. That's legally not allowed for good reasons, because there are precedents for that in political history. So what's this kind of need to find the pure native, who is pure in politics and victimhood, combined with them needing to answer for the violence of their oppressors, because we're not just oppressed by Israelis, we're oppressed by the same dude who asked you this question at the info table that you had. That's an equal oppression. I don't want to be in solidarity with this man. I have nothing to do with him, and everything that Palestinians have been lobbying for, writing out, and everything has nothing to do with this dude. So I don't even know why we are constantly put in connection with them. That is the same trajectory, even if it's the other side of the coin, of calling us Nazis. On the one hand, we are called Nazis. On the other hand, we have to respond for them and answer on behalf of them. That's the same thing. Okay? And now I forgot the rest of it. The rest was like the evolution of anti-Semitism. Look, we cannot define anti-Semitism in one time and space. That just doesn't exist. Okay, there's no race and no racism, whether that's anti-Black, anti-Sinti and Roma, anti-Jewish, anti-Palestinian, that has always been the same throughout the past 500 or even longer history of, what we know, what racism is. So I don't really, I personally, when I talk about racism against Jews, I speak of anti-Jewish racism to bring the conversation back into the fold epistemologically as well as methodologically to what racism and colonialism means. And not separating it ontologically and epistemologically from what racism is. That's one thing. And another thing is because I think the term anti-Semitism as one word without a dash has been entirely co-opted by the nation state. And I think that should be something that is very worrying. Everybody who does political science, gender studies, queer studies, whatever, colonial studies, really, if you went to university and know what the state is, usually people have been killed by empires and states through wars and genocide. It was not a minority that ever had even the means and possibilities to do that. So when we are now witnessing a nation state claiming to know and define, and in this case, what Jewishness means, which is equally fucked up, but to also even define what racism means, everybody should get worried. And it's so fascinating to me that every time I say this in public to people look at me with these big eyes and they don't understand. And I can say everything that I said right now, historically speaking, the majority of people have been killed by their own nation states or by the empires trying to take them over, who somehow laid claim to it as well, but not by minorities. So this kind of normalized and completely sanitized belief in the nation state is so deep by now that we don't even question that, the anti-Semitism commissioners of, Austria or Germany have all some very, public and historical problematic backgrounds, apart from the fact that they're not even Jewish, maybe that's actually good because that way you can see that this is a white supremacist endeavor, where Jews are just being used as a narrative frame, which then falls back into another anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish racist trope to say, oh, Jews are doing it. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered all the questions now. I think there was a third one that I forgot now, but maybe Sladjana wants to say something.
No, I think you answered everything and more than everything. I would just reiterate some of the things that Anna said in perhaps in a different way a bit, and that's something also that the other day we briefly talked about when we talked with you all about looking at who's forcing what kind of a narrative and who's trying to set the importance of what kind of questions, right, and on whose behalf they are speaking, and what that act of speaking does to the situation, right? What it enables and what it prevents. And that's something also that Anna now has very how should I put it, fully explain you how it operates and what it does, right? Because it shifts the attention from the topics and from the topics that we should be discussing. It takes away the political power to the moment, because it puts those who are basically targets of violence into defensive position. They need to defend not only their lives, but they need to defend the position of actually needing to defend themselves, having the right to exist. So it's very important when we look at the discourses to and again, we both Anna and I talked how the settler colonial and colonial violence in general, they operate through different forms of violence that is a cluster. There is a reason why it's called colonial matrix, right? So narratives are also part of that violence, part of that erasure. Right, we can. I mean, perhaps a bad example, but I'm going to bring it. We can talk about people feeling unsafe at the campuses, in the universities in the West, because there are people protesting, calling for ceasefire and end of genocide. But at the same time, and we are focusing on that instead of actually focusing on the fact that there is no universities anymore in Gaza. They have been all leveled. There has been a systematic scholasticide in Gaza. The professors have been targeted. The poets have been targeted. People who are in Gaza, in what we know as Gaza Strip, but also Palestinians abroad, right? So it is really important that before we kind of slip into the trap of which narratives we kind of find important to engage with, which discourses we choose to participate in, to think about where is this discourse coming from and what it does, right? Whom it serves to have this as the kind of the first news in the today's news, and what it hides. I think that's one of the things. I don't know if Anna agrees, but I think that's an important part when we talk about violence, when we talk about silencing, when we talk about genocide, when we talk about coloniality and settler colonialism.
And something else, I mean, it's not only Gaza universities that are now, actually materially entirely eliminated. It's been an ongoing process already in the West Bank, which has not been under that much state control by Israel and the PA, that have been entirely surveilled. So that maybe Birzeit isn't as surveilled, but every other university in the West Bank cannot really follow the so-called standards. I don't even know what that means in these days anymore, of academic freedom and research, up to the point where, the appointment of people and what is being taught. There were actually clashes on campuses, several years, like 2 years. When was it? 2 years ago, 2 years, 2024, 22 and 21. And between forces that, between the PA, let's say, and student movements that wanted a decolonial and a Palestinian-oriented scholarship and university administration. Anyway, so that's just on the side. And I also wanted to say something, because it really troubles me, this whole thing about, this neo-Nazi that is now joining the Palestinian resistance or something like that. I don't know what the fuck is going on in this man's brain, but I always get the same question. So I want to say something else to that. Instead of asking Palestinians to answer for white supremacy and how it shape shifts and changes through time and space, like a crazy man that takes on the gear that they need in order to parade themselves as whatever they want to parade themselves in that moment, right? Let's look at history. So you want to talk about anti-Jewish racism or anti-Semitism. So Jews, along with Muslims, have been kicked out of Spain, right? With the conquista, as they call it, the reconquista, whatever, At that time, a lot of Jews, but also Huguenots later on, from France, have moved to the Americas as a safe place. Then once the Portuguese and the Spanish, took over the south of the Americas and stuff, these populations have moved up north. At that point, Jews have also been discriminated in England. They've been discriminated in Holland, but in the colonies, they came in as a very interesting and useful minority. not only because of the trading opportunities that they had, just like the Huguenots or others, but because in the colonies, in an intra-imperial war over territory and populations, people turn white, and all these religious and ethnic divisions that literally led to Europe at that time being a war zone, were kind of evened out in the colonies, where people essentially became white for the mere fact of gaining control over a Black enslaved or African enslaved and indigenous population, including the land, right? So making certain types of racism or discrimination profitable, manageable, as well as consumable in times of conflict with another imperial enemy is as old as colonialism. So I'm not, I think this idea, which is why I said racial literacy in the very beginning, this man does not know racial history, does not know colonial history, let alone anti-Semitic trajectories through time and space, because if he knew, he would know that he was an actual white supremacist, anti-Semite, simple as that, right? But this knowledge is not taught, and these populations are never confronted with it and said, I'm researching that shit because I'm constantly confronted with it. And now I have to teach you for free.
Yeah. So we have spoken a little bit about how the colonial project is actually possible due to the control of the narrative that we know, of course, happens due to this power imbalance. And keeping some concepts alive, such as anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, actually doesn't broaden the context to bring the true liberation, and I say liberation, not peace, for the Palestinian people. How can we actually achieve? How can we broaden the context, the discussion, to try to achieve something for liberation?
Well, broadening discussion, or actually trying to, as Anna already pointed out, getting some racial literacy, but also actually trying not to slip into this trap, into these courses. That's one thing. The other thing is also by trying not to center the I would say, I'm tempted to say the wrong things, but not to recenter the violent system, right? Not to shift the focus from the ongoing violence and the genocide, and also I would say to protest. I think we can learn. We all can learn a lot by looking at the ongoing solidarity protests by the students. I think that always the movements are kind of a pedagogical moments for us, telling us how things can be done, and not only the protests that are ongoing these past few weeks, but also in the historical perspective, right? As I already mentioned, there's a rich history of transnational solidarities with the Palestinians, but also the transnational solidarities that Palestinians have showed and expressed towards the liberation, anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, Standing Rock, etc. So it is. I mean, I was listening to a talk by Nelson Mandela Torres from a few weeks ago, where he was asked how the attack at even the decoloniality light in the universities is perceived as a kind of a threat, right? How it shows that the kind of the colonial system is even the decoloniality light perceived as a threat. But then he said, the South African team didn't really need the scholars from the universities, who are also part of the reproduction of the coloniality, right, to tell them what to do. They knew what to do, right? And in their case in front of that they presented, they actually do theorize both the kind of the settler colonialism, the genocide that comes with it, but also how how important it is to speak against it. So I think that looking at the movements and building the movements, knowing how to be in solidarity, not asking how to be, but actually practicing that, right, is one part of the answer. But I would say also education is another part, not necessarily education, not necessarily only going to the universities to get that education, but getting literacy in the systems of oppression and how they operate. So yeah, I don't know if I answered, but also I'm not sure whether I understood the question completely. Perhaps Anna was better at understanding what was asked, if I digress too much.
I think the question was about Palestinian liberation and how to get there. And Elma is asking in the chat about the sovereignty between the European and Israeli and Western states against their populations. Yes, of course. That is what I call the war on anti-Semitism in my work. That definitely is there and has been going on for a lot of time. And it might even be, yeah, I don't know. So I think, and I'm mentioning that question from the chat right now because it ties into my answer to liberation. I think a lot of people understand liberation as, and that's where the epistemological nationalism, I'm coming back to nationalism because we're so deeply rooted in it, apparently, even in the way we understand problems. We talk about transnationalism and transnational solidarities, but then everybody gets trapped in their own national community somehow, whether that's because of language, whether that's because of history and knowledge, or simply the networks that you have or don't have, right? So there is a real, and parts of it is real, right? Because there's only so much you can do in a day, especially when if you have to labor on the side, or if you have care work for the elderly, for children, whatever it is, right? So there are real impediments to transnational organizing, but I think the first thing that people need to understand is that the problems we have are all connected. As Sladjana already said, from Palestine to Standing Rock, right? This is not just the rallying cry that people, come up with because, I don't know, they have a friend in Turtle Island, No, that because people, as Sladjana said, physically understand through their buddies what the connections are. So I would say, very basic, the connection between Standing Rock and Palestine is capitalism, settler colonial or coloniality, whatever you want to call it, the extraction of people and resources, terraforming of land and people and plans. So that's one thing. So follow the supply chain. All right. Follow the supply chain of the weapons that go there, as well as the funky bio olive oil product that you are being marketed for a lot of money from Palestine, where the actual violent uprooting of the Palestinian olive tree is not even mentioned in a second, right? That's one example, right? So follow the supply chain from, some kind of whitewash ecosystem capitalism to actual hardcore, the hardcore weapons industry, as well as research institutions that cooperate, because academia is part and parcel of conquest. You conquer through knowledge. So that's one thing. And another thing about anti-racism, if it, and I usually connect that to anti-fascist or anti-colonial, which is the same thing for me, struggles. I don't know what people want these days. I'm a bit it's mind-boggling to me for years now that usually when I meet young activists or people asking that it's so dangerous and we lose our jobs and all of that stuff, I have lost so many jobs, I've been living precariously for so long. There is no anti-fascist, anti-colonial struggle in history even, where you don't pay for it. So if you want to let's put it differently. The minute you make money from anti-colonial or anti-racism work, something is wrong. If everybody wants to hear you and market you and put you on a pedestal and say XYZ is coming to speak, that means you're not dangerous anymore, right? And just because you have one Angela Davis doesn't mean that all the other people that were not Angela Davis never made it to become Angela Davis. So just because you have one person that is being heralded as, a freedom fighter, Martin Luther King, but not Malcolm X, right? There are these tropes of singling out individual people in order to not really show the structure of a system. So I'm saying, in short, anti-racism needs to remain dangerous. And the minute it is dangerous and you can feel it on your body and on your bank account, you're doing the right thing. Because that is what a political economy means. In a Marxist sense, in a racial capitalist sense, or whatever, it doesn't matter. The economy is political. So if you say something that is consumable and that people want to hear, it's probably not radical enough, you know? So yeah, I think that's it. You know, this is not just about Palestine. Maybe the last thing, okay? There's other genocides happening right now. But we do know that the extraction for gas in front of Palestine, as well as in front of Lebanon, as well as the mining of cobalt in Congo, they're all related. And I think, you know, you can fill in the gaps here because that's really not too difficult to connect. And that's the connection. That's the supply chain. And that is why people in power don't care. Which is also another thing, what I want to say, we don't, if we're just talking about Palestinian liberation, we're really missing the point right now, because I think now is the time to make a decolonial question, whatever that actually means. I think we really need to have a conversation of what that can actually mean and what we mean by it, because university talking about decoloniality is not it. But maybe now is the time to actually talk about the material decolonization. And now fill in the blank. I think this is the conversations that we need to have across the world, you know, and maybe we can use Palestine as a trigger for that instead of, you know, an event where it will stop, right? Structure and event. So that's that.
Yeah, Anna, I may just add, if you don't mind, to what you already pointed out. I think that's something that slips the focus every once in, well, more often than not, and that's the question of capitalism, right? We in the beginning we said that the settler colonialism relies on global racial capitalism. It's one of its interlocking system of oppression, which allows it to kind of exist, to continue existing, right? And capitalism has always been a war economy. Just look how capitalism survives. It survives with another war. Look what happened now after. Since October, right, where the selling of the bombs, of the missiles has skyrocketed. In addition to the economy, right? Anna also pointed it out. Is like when she's talked about the destruction of olives, right? We have also the treating of people and of world as resources, which is part of both colonialism and capitalism, because they function together. It is again, it is a matrix. So we have world as resources, nature as resources, people as resources, and something that can be disposable. So in parallel to all of this, we have environmental warfare. So not only that all these struggles against colonialism are interlocked, we are really all connected, because we can't run away from the environmental warfare. Part of the climate changes that are like so in a particular form, though I'm not going to get into it. A big discussion in the West, right? Is that, oh, you know, this is a big crisis, and it is, but we cannot look at that crisis without taking into consideration the colonialism, the ongoing settler colonial project, coloniality as such, and global racial capitalism that contributes to that, right? So we are really all in this together. It's not just a kind of a slogan that you can put on your, I don't know, Instagram post or Twitter account. You know, we are all in this together. We are really all in this together, and we have to wake up. And as Anna said, I hope we are waking up now. Whatever. And see where that can take us, right? And I would rather look at the movements for the inspiration, what to look for in decolonization, whatever decolonization will, wherever it takes us, than into academy. But that's a story for another occasion.
If I may just comment, like something personal, what makes me to feel almost kind of hopeless is we see this as solidarity and this maybe change of narrative. It's like a bottom-up movement. But for example, there were discussions at the university stage, at academia stages, right? Where I had my personal feeling those experts are more interested to secure their position and their title rather than standing behind the truth. And we try, like we are trying really hard, like every one of us here, we are sitting together, we work, but then you go or cultural stages here in Innsbruck in Austria, like they invite people that are publicly known to spread Islamophobia. But you know, these are the people who are invited, who get a stage to speak. And it's just a comment like we try, but the top-down movement is so strong. Like it's like, and if you feel so how would I say it? Oh, not
I get it. I think we understand. What I want to say to that, and again, and maybe that's a bit harsh, but this is a decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-fascist struggle. It's always been like that. That is why women of color, Black people, Indigenous people, Palestinians are saying we're tired all the time. Because it's always been like that. It's never been different. So because the white European citizen that has been shielded from this life experience for the longest time now is now waking up to this. This is your Vietnam moment, your generation, right? Where you realize that that shit is connected, right? And that there's actually a longer trajectory, right? To the violence being inflicted, and a broader trajectory as well. This is your moment right now. So yes, it's difficult, it's painful, you will tire out, it looks entirely bleak, and other people will get the stage, will get the jobs, and they continue with their racist talk, because yes, it's a political economy and everybody is scared for their jobs. Yes, that is capitalism, but that's nothing special. That doesn't just happen to you. That has been happening to the Palestinian people, including their resistance, including the diaspora, to Black people, to Indigenous people, to Latinos, all the time. So this is nothing special, really. I think what this young generation, in particular in Europe, or maybe in Austria and Germany as well, need to understand is that this is a global structure of violence and war that everyone is implied in. And now you're becoming the targets with your buddies of that violent structures. But the only difference is you haven't been the targets before. So now you're getting, in other words, the Palestinian treatment. That's all I have to say to that. Now it is your responsibility to think very strongly and hard about, is this too much for me? Do I want to fall back on my white advantage and white privilege, or whatever you want to call it, or European privilege, even, because I have also European privilege. I'm not being killed immediately, right? I can still travel. I can still get access to education, et cetera, right? So do I want to fall back on it? Do I want to fall back on this little pouch of security that is only conditionally granted? Don't forget that. So if the shit hits the fan and war comes back, none of you will have it either. And then you will think, oh my God, why didn't I do something earlier when I could have stopped it? Because they've been testing it on us. They've been testing it on other migrants. They've been testing it on Muslims, on Black people, and so on and so forth. No one stood up for us. And then the shit comes home to roost, and everybody is like, oh my God, how could this happen? Well, it was aliens like the Nazis that descended from 1933 to 1945. No, the Nazis were not aliens. They didn't just descend from outer space, and it wasn't just fucking Hitler. Okay, it was entire Europe. It was 500 years of genocide and killing. And the Germans just thought, well, our neighbors have done it for hundreds of years. Why can't we do it? That's it. So that is something that I want you to think about. This is when the chicken come home to roost. Okay, so I understand the depression and the bleak outlook. Trust me, I have it all the fucking time. Excuse my French again, but when Antonio Gramsci wrote the prison notes in prison, he came up with this, and before he was tried, right? The Italian judge or the Italian prosecutor said, we have to stop this brain from thinking. And Antonio Gramsci, that's one thing, right? So don't stop thinking. Second thing is, Gramsci wrote what the pessimism of the mind, but the optimism of the will. So you're going to die from your wounds in prison or from prison, right? But you're still going to do it. And that is how you remain dangerous, actually, to not succumb to this pessimism and not do anything anymore. Because that's easy, and that's privilege. I don't know if that was a bit too harsh now, but there you go.
That was good. I would just add to that one thing, and it's that you can choose whether you're going to be anti-war and only after the war ends, or you're going to actually react a bit earlier. And I think part of the responsibility of the academia and the scholarship in the West is also, instead of trying to teach to talk to students about the genocides after the genocides happen, to actually react and prevent genocides happening in the first place.
Okay, thank you, you two. Now I would like leave the space open for more questions, and there's one question left in the chat. It might be already answered from Leon Hoffman. With the ongoing militarization around the world, I wonder how the peace movement can resist by encouraging people to engage in non-violent activities while nationalism is rapidly on the rise, especially when we wonder what comes after Israel's massive violence. I think it already was answered a little bit, or do you feel you can maybe add more to that question?
I mean, I think I would ask the question: what's again the political impetus for asking about nonviolence, historically speaking? And I'm not asking from an ethical perspective, because nobody likes violence. If you ask a person individually, I think no. But what's that insistence on nonviolence when the system that we are fighting, whether that is capitalism or settler colonialism, is so deeply violent? How do you, maybe I want to give that back. How do you think you can fight a fascist regime, no matter where in the world, non-violently? And please give me the example from history where that worked, only as a non-violent movement. And please don't come up with South Africa right now, and don't come up with India, because I'm gonna talk you down.
I think that's also kind of an aspect where you have this expectation of the so-called quote-unquote civility, right? And kind of a particular performance in order to be understood as someone who's asking or striving for peace, right? And that's also one way of one way of shifting the focus that we already talked about, right? Because again, it's about the proper ways of doing things, of the proper way of protesting, the proper way of talking about something, and one aspect of actually fighting against it is creating this counter-hegemonic vocabulary, among other things, right? Just not falling into this trap of on what kind of terms we are having the conversation and who's dictating those terms, and what is expected of people suffering the violence, how they should behave, how they should appear in order to be considered to be credible, right? And that's in itself is violence. That is part of the oppressive systems.
I mean, I think also what becomes very important, not only, this kind of civility and bourgeois civility discourses, that co-opt whatever strategy has actually made resistance possible and co-opted the most sanitized and usually legalized perspective to say this is the one that changed the system, to deny that it was actually often mass protests of people that were violent and non-violent that actually led to the shaking of the system. So that's one thing, right? To take away the power of the people again. That's one thing. And then another thing, maybe for the future, because I've been in a conversation with South Africa recently in a talk similar to that. And one South African then said, well, this is, the Palestinian moment. We know this from South Africa. When in the Bantustans and in the Bantustans, when the first white police officers were killed, that was the trigger point, to get it really going, right? And I'm just like, I mean, surely that triggered a lot in, it kind of unleashed a certain kind of fear of confronting a white supremacist apartheid regime. That, by the way, apartheid is such a weird terminology, right? It was a settler colonial white supremacist regime that worked very well with Israel and the United States of America and any other settler colonial state, actually, for that matter. So that's one thing. So that might have worked in the 70s in South Africa. Today we see what happens in Palestine, and this is, again, a global economy that is already being transported to the rest of the world as we speak, and in the future it will only increase. Palestinian bodies have lived as, the walking dead for the international weapons industry, right? As bodies that are there to be tested upon. So what we witness today is an automated AI-generated war where it is drones that come to kill us. And by the way, I want to say something else, there have been automated drones on Palestinian, on entrances to refugee camps in the West Bank before October 2023. Okay, so these things have already been in place where actually a little drone or a little automated camera decides if they shoot you or not. There's not even anybody operating in the control room anymore, which is something that, of the entrance to Gaza. In fact, that's an automated control room where you get shot by weapons, automated and directed by someone sitting in an operating room, right? We're on the next level. We're hunted down by automatic dogs, automated drones, right? So this is an automated genocide and an automated repression as well, for the question about, the repression of populations. What we do see is the surveillance of your Instagram, of Twitter. People log into chats, right? I mean, I think the future of resistance really needs to take seriously the repression made possible by the technology that we all use every single day. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense, right? But again, the supply chain and so on and so forth on how these technologies are being produced. But if we want to have a transnational organizing that is dangerous, I think that is something, for instance, today that needs to be thought through, which has not happened the generations before. I think that's really important.
So I would take the last question from the chat and then end the conversation. How can we work on this in academia, especially German, Austrian academia, when we want to produce knowledge but might be fired or contracts not renewed? Should we exit academia, but then again we lose some epistemic power? So who wants to talk about that?
Well, I don't think that academia is a carrier of the epistemic power in totality. Academia is a corporate neoliberal enterprise that is part and parcel of the coloniality. And it is really one of the, perhaps the best power moves when it comes to coloniality of knowledge that has been done is selling this argument that academia is neutral, and while being exactly the opposite, right? So I guess it's the question of whether you consider that the knowledge produced within academic industrial complex is the most legitimate form of knowledge, and that in order to have that knowledge, you have to stay within academia. It's one of the questions that each of us has to answer. And the other question that Anna has mentioned on several occasions in this conversation tonight is actually the contract. I mean, academia is a job, right? It provides the salary for people. And academia also likes things that can be sold, because again, it is a neoliberal capitalist enterprise. So it is really about. This is my dog. I apologize, but my dog also reacts to the question in academia. So it is really each and every one of us decision to make what we want to do. There are I will stop because my dog will keep barking.
Yeah, I'm also, I think I was very naive when I entered my PhD program as well. And I thought I thought very much that this is the space where critique is possible when I started. And I think Sladjana just said it already. So I'm going to answer another question, because my hope and belief in academia is close to zero by now. I think the side of activism and even the side of knowledge for racial literacy, for Palestine or the Black liberation struggle, whatever, name it, has never been academia. It was activism, always. And activism was always the first and prime side of knowledge, whether that was for Karl Marx, for those who wrote against colonialism, for feminists, for queers, it wasn't, someone teaching us at university, okay? That came after. Academia co-opts instead of produces it. So that's one thing. And I think you just have to decide for yourself what kind of life you want to live. That's what my PhD supervisor once told me. And I think that's a very profound, deep philosophical moment. You got to think deeply about it. And as for, this kind of nonviolence here, it keeps popping up, Leon and Tina and all of that, that's all very sweet. I appreciate it. Again, the sphere of violence is something that speaks already to a certain positionality of privilege, I think, because other people just don't have the possibility to be scared of violence because it structures their life every day. And what I find interesting is that not only is obviously BDS a boycott call, which is enshrined in international law, it's one of the longest standing peaceful moment of how India, South Africa at some point, the Black liberation struggle or civil movement, civil rights movement has pivoted its politics, right? Again, the context being capitalism. It was not an an undoing of capitalism. It was just the question of, can we maybe limit our consumerism, right? So instead of buying Coca-Cola, please buy the lemonade from your neighbor. I think that's a great idea, by the way. Please boycott Coca-Cola. But if we start talking about boycotts, we need to boycott a lot of people. I definitely would always boycott arms and military personnel in the weapons industry, definitely. But focusing it on that will bite us back in the long run. And I want to say something else to that. This kind of abolition was mentioned here. Like, I think, where did I see abolition? I forgot. Anyways, or maybe I'm just imagining it. But I'm connecting this in my head to abolitionism. And I think abolitionism, even though I do not disagree with it, but again, I would also critically ask you to inquire what abolitionism has come to replace. And that is the revolutionary moment. And in the revolutionary moment, we're not just talking about a more easily and understandable, consumable, way of reframing, reforming what is already there, but by all means necessary, tear down the system. Now, I'm not saying that once this happens, we have all the answers and we'll do it better. No, but I think we always need to critically interrogate what concepts are becoming very mainstream, whether that's decoloniality, right, or decolonizing the moment, abolitionism, and that we can talk about it every day, and what are we not allowed to talk about? Right? So we're not allowed to talk about boycott right now because it's Palestine, because it's the moment, right? But even within that, even boycott works within liberal notions of law and never undoes capitalism, right? So it is up to you guys, to decide what you endorse at what point in time. I think Ramshi gave us some tools. He said, there's a certain strategic moment as well. You can use a certain, boycott strategy and also endorse others. But always be aware of the larger questions that you are asking if you really want to, create in the process another world. Yeah, that is happening today, actually. So I think this is happening today.